Harold Bennett, a seasoned veteran, made his way toward the boarding gate. His cane tapped softly against the polished airport floor, his faded army jacket hanging loosely on his frail frame. The patches on the jacket told stories of years gone by, of service and sacrifice. Underneath his cap, strands of white hair framed his wrinkled face. His eyes, though tired, sparkled with quiet pride. Flying to Seattle wasn't a big deal for him. It was for a ceremony to honor his old military unit. Harold wasn't fond of the attention, but felt it was necessary to attend, especially since so many of his comrades had passed. Samantha, a young gate agent, glanced at Harold as he handed her his boarding pass. For a brief moment, her smile faltered before she forced it back on. "Sir," she said, her voice polite but firm, "this ticket is invalid for this flight." Harold frowned. "That can't be right. I bought it a month ago." Samantha's eyes briefly flickered with impatience as she scanned the pass again and shook her head. "I'm sorry, but this seat has already been assigned to someone else. You'll have to wait here while we resolve this." Harold sighed, unfazed. He had flown often enough for things like this to happen. "All right," he said, stepping aside as passengers flowed past him onto the jet bridge. Behind him, a man in his 30s, Andrew Taylor, leaned casually against a nearby pillar, observing the situation. Dressed in a simple black hoodie and jeans, Andrew didn't seem like anything special, just another passenger. But he wasn't just anyone. He owned Taylor Aviation, the airline Harold was trying to board. Andrew often flew anonymously, blending in with the crowd to see how his staff treated passengers. As he watched, Andrew's sharp eyes narrowed. He overheard a bit of conversation between Samantha and a co-worker. "Looks like it's overbooked. He'll probably cause a scene. Shouldn't let him on. It'll be easier." Andrew's jaw tightened. He didn't like the tone of their words. Returning his attention to Harold, he watched the old man, who stood quietly, cane trembling under his grip. Minutes turned into 10, then 15, as more passengers boarded, some casting sympathetic glances at Harold, while others hardly noticed him. Samantha returned, her face neutral. "I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett, but there's no seat for you on this flight." Harold blinked, surprised. "What do you mean no seat? I paid for my ticket. I have somewhere I need to be." "I understand, sir," Samantha replied, her tone now flat, "but the flight is overbooked, and we can't accommodate you." Andrew's ears perked up, and he moved closer, pretending to check his phone as he overheard the conversation. Samantha's tone had shifted, no longer polite but dismissive, as if she wanted Harold to give up and leave. Harold straightened, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I just want the seat I paid for." Samantha smirked. "Sir, let's not make this difficult. I'm sure we can rebook you for a flight tomorrow." Before Harold could respond, a small boy tugged on his mother's sleeve nearby. The child pointed at Harold's jacket and whispered about the medals pinned to it. The mother gave Harold a brief, awkward smile before hurrying her son away. Unable to stand it any longer, Andrew stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Excuse me, what seems to be the problem here?" Samantha looked taken aback for a moment before her professional demeanor slipped. "Oh, no problem. We're just assisting this passenger." "Assisting him by denying his seat?" Andrew raised an eyebrow. Harold, startled by the stranger's intervention, tried to downplay the situation. "It's all right, son. I'll figure it out." Andrew ignored Harold's attempt and turned back to Samantha. "He has a valid ticket, doesn't he?" Samantha hesitated, then reluctantly agreed. "Yes, but—" "Then he should be allowed to board." Andrew's tone hardened. "Overbooking is your mistake, not his." Samantha flushed and turned away quickly to confer with another employee. Andrew turned to Harold, offering a small smile. "I'm Andrew. Mind if I hang around to make sure they don't give you the runaround?" Harold chuckled softly. "Suit yourself. Appreciate it." As they waited, Andrew struck up a casual conversation with Harold. He learned that Harold had served in the Korean War and was traveling to reunite with what little remained of his unit for an awards ceremony. Harold spoke modestly, glossing over the details, but Andrew could sense the depth of his experiences. Eventually, Samantha returned with a sour expression. "We found a seat for you, sir, but it's not in economy. It's in the last row, next to the restroom." Harold's shoulders slumped, but he nodded. "That'll do." Andrew, however, wasn't satisfied. "That's unacceptable. He paid for a specific seat." Samantha's smile returned, but it was forced. "It's the best we can do." Andrew's gaze sharpened. He wanted to call out Samantha's behavior, but something held him back. There was more to this than he knew, and he wanted to see how it played out. As Harold made his way toward the plane, Andrew followed, his mind racing. It wasn't until Harold stumbled slightly, dropping his small duffel bag, that Andrew saw it, a glint of metal spilling out. It was a metal, old but clearly polished. Andrew's heart skipped a beat as he bent down to help Harold. When he picked up the metal, his breath caught. The inscription was unmistakable. He had seen that metal before, on the mantelpiece of his late grandfather. Andrew's hands trembled as he handed the metal back to Harold. Could this be the same Harold Bennett his grandfather had spoken about? Andrew didn't know for sure yet, but he was determined to find out. As Harold took his seat in the cramped last row near the restroom, Andrew followed, pretending to check his phone. The metal on Harold's bag was identical to one his grandfather, Richard Taylor, had often shown him. The Distinguished Service Cross, an honor only a few men earned. Andrew had to know more. The flight attendants began their pre-flight checks as Samantha's voice floated over the intercom. Andrew decided to wait, not wanting to overwhelm Harold. He would observe and piece everything together. When the plane leveled out, Andrew took a deep breath and stood, making his way to the back. He pretended to stretch near the restroom before leaning toward Harold. "Mind if I sit here for a bit?" Andrew asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. Harold squinted at him, then nodded. "Sure, young man, as long as you don't mind the smell back here." He gestured to the nearby restroom. Andrew chuckled. "I've had worse. That's an impressive medal you've got there. Distinguished Service Cross, right?" Andrew continued. Harold's eyes flickered with surprise. "Not many recognize it these days. My grandfather had one," Andrew said conversationally. "He used to tell me stories about the men he served with. He said they were the real heroes." Harold gave a soft, knowing smile. "Your grandfather must have been one of them." Andrew paused, carefully choosing his next words. "He talked a lot about someone named Harold Bennett. He said he wouldn't be alive if it weren't for you." The old man's expression shifted, his smile fading into something deeper, a mixture of pride and sadness. "Richard Taylor," Harold murmured. "I remember him. Fine soldier. A good man." "That was my grandfather," Andrew said, his heart tightening. "He used to tell me how you saved his life. He said he owed you everything." Harold's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your grandfather was braver than he gave himself credit for. He kept our unit together when everything else fell apart. We lost a lot of good men." Andrew didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of Harold's words settle. After a moment, he asked, "Why didn't he ever tell me what you did?" Harold chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Men like your grandfather didn't dwell on the past. They didn't want their families carrying that burden. Besides, what I did, it was just part of the job." Andrew shook his head. "Not everyone would have done it." Harold shrugged. "Maybe. But it's not something I like to dwell on." Their conversation was interrupted by Samantha, who approached with a tight smile. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat." Andrew met her gaze evenly. "I'm fine here, thanks." Samantha's jaw tightened. "It's against policy to block the aisle near the restrooms for too long." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "I'm sitting in an empty seat, not blocking anything." Harold cleared his throat. "It's all right, son. Don't cause trouble on my account." Andrew bit back a retort. "I'll be back," he said quietly to Harold, before giving Samantha a pointed look and returning to his seat. Back in his row, Andrew's mind raced. He had heard enough to confirm that Harold was the same man his grandfather had revered, but there was something else, a burden Harold wasn't sharing. Andrew could feel it in the pauses, the way Harold avoided talking about his own actions. He was carrying something heavy, and Andrew was determined to understand it. Pulling out his phone, Andrew scrolled through his emails until he found a message from his operations manager about a new veteran outreach initiative. The irony wasn't lost on him. One of the greatest veterans he had ever met, and his own airline had treated him like an inconvenience. As he absorbed the weight of Harold's words, the heroism, the sacrifice, the burden of those days, it was more than he could fully grasp, but he felt a deep sense of reverence for the man before him. His grandfather's stories had only scratched the surface of what Harold had truly endured. Andrew cleared his throat, finding his voice. "Your actions, what you did for Richard, for your whole unit, it's incredible, Harold. But you never talk about it. Why?" Harold's gaze softened, and he looked down at the coffee in front of him, stirring it slowly. "War changes people, son. You don't talk about it because no one can understand. You just live with it. Move on. The ones who were there, they know. And the ones who weren't, They'll never understand. Andrew leaned forward, his voice quieter now. But you shouldn't have to carry all that alone. Not anymore. Harold met Andrew's eyes, the lines on his face deepening as he nodded slightly. I've carried it this long. It's part of me now. But maybe it's time someone knew. They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the airport fading into the background as the weight of the conversation settled between them. Harold wasn't just a soldier from a past war. He was a man who had lived a life of duty, sacrifice, and quiet heroism, and Andrew now understood how much more there was to the story. Finally, Andrew spoke again. I don't know how much I can do, Harold, but I'm not going to let this go. Your story deserves to be known, and you deserve to be recognized for what you've done, not just for my grandfather, but for everything. Harold gave him a small smile, a faint glimmer of pride in his eyes. You've got a good heart, young man. But don't go making a fuss about me. There's nothing to prove. Andrew smiled back, but there was determination in his gaze. It's not about proving anything. It's about making sure the world knows that men like you, the real heroes, get the respect they've earned. Harold didn't reply, but his shoulders seemed to relax just a little. For the first time since their meeting, Andrew felt as though he was beginning to understand the depth of what Harold had lived through, and the quiet strength that had carried him through it all. As they finished their coffee, Andrew made a silent vow. Harold Bennett's story would be told, not just as a footnote in history, but as a testament to the courage and sacrifice that defined the men who fought, not for glory, but for each other.